born to Johannes and Marguerite Luther in the late 1400s. Martin Luther's early life is not well known. What is known to us is, like many whose parents worked in hard labor, Luther's father wanted him to be a lawyer, to be successful, and to use his exceptional intelligence towards something greater than himself. Luther, even in his early years, had an intelligence and drive to stand for truth no matter the cost. He recalls a time during his early school years where he was thrashed 15 times for failing to conjugate and decline a certain Latin verb. Luther's reason? It was the instructor's fault, as the verb had never actually been taught to the class. Luther's famous stand, however, was not against a teacher in a class with the threat of lashings. No, he would have to stand against a much bigger, much more powerful opponent with a much greater potential consequence. This is the In History Show on the Semper Reformanda podcast. I'm your host, Cody Bockelkamp. In 1505, Luther was walking towards Dotternheim, a small village in Germany, when he was caught in a severe thunderstorm. The storm raged enough that a lightning bolt sent Luther to the ground, crying to the Catholic saint of miners, "Saint Anne, save me, and I will become a monk." While this might seem to be a simple statement made in a moment of terror, Luther was a man of his word. Because it was not but weeks later that Luther had submitted himself to the rule of the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. He did so with such a vigor that, looking back on his time, he said, "I kept the rule so strictly that if ever a monk got to heaven by his sheer monkery, it was I. If I had kept on any longer, I should have killed myself with the vigils and prayers, reading, and other work." During his time at the monastery, Luther was a man who was overcome with the dwelling on his own sinful nature, so much so that his physical life began to mirror his spiritual one, loveless and cold. It was said that Luther at times would fast for days on end or sleep with no blanket to cover him in the dead of winter. Luther's only safe haven from himself was reading in the scriptures. Eventually, Luther became the chair of biblical studies at Wittenberg University, and he came across the nagging idea that would eventually change his life forever. Luther struggled with the idea of Jesus' quotation of Psalm 22 on the cross of being forsaken by God. Luther wrestled with his own feelings of being forsaken by God and Jesus' identification with sinful humanity. These thoughts eventually coupled into a profound revelation in 1515. Luther came to realize that through a passage in Romans that, quote, "the justice of God is that righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy of God, justifies us through faith. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise." It was upon this truth that Luther looked around him and saw the distinction between what he had just come to realize and that of the Church of Rome's doctrine of justification on the merits of faith and good works. This seed began to grow in the mind of Luther. The Catholic Church, its doctrine, and its practices had gone far enough. To understand the scope of Luther's opponent, to come to the same realization that Luther did, we have to examine the state in which people lived in relation to the Roman Catholic Church. You see, hundreds of years prior to Luther, the Roman Catholic Church was on a trajectory that could not have led anywhere else except to the Reformation. You see, in the 1200s, Pope Innocent III waged war in a crusade, but not against the Muslim Turks, but against Christian heretics. The resulting political and spiritual absurdity was so brutal that even Innocent himself was surprised. Quote, "It isn't too often that good Christian men can save their souls and at the same time enlarge their kingdoms by butchering unbelievers." This merging of spiritual and brutal political ends always justified the means to the Roman Catholic Church of the day. In 1252, the next Innocent, Pope Innocent IV, authorized torture as a means of getting information and confessions from accused heretics. And while it is true that canon law forbids the shedding of blood from a cleric, he was still allowed to, quote, "hound and interrogate and torture prisoners for confessions of heresy, where only after the confession they would be turned over to the civil authorities, usually for burning at the stake." So you see, the church would keep its hands clean of the blood by not finishing off the poor souls they mutilated. But with power and continued overlap between spiritual and political spheres, the job always got done. When I speak of power, it can be hard to understand the true nature of that word in this situation. Everything from popes who basically controlled kings to ones who fancied themselves as king. Boniface VIII was known to appear, quote, before pilgrims crying, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." According to some, his crown of the papacy contained 48 rubies, 72 sapphires, 45 emeralds, and 66 large pearls. Others noted that the generous celebrants kept 2 priests busy night and day, raking together infinite money. But it wasn't just this societal and financial corruption. It was also theological. The doctrine of transubstantiation, as it is defined by the Roman Catholic Church, is one that divides the Church up to this current day. Transubstantiation is referring to what many know as communion. On the surface, it's the belief that the communion elements become the actual body and blood of Jesus. While this in and of itself does not divide the Roman Catholics from the Protestants, the elaboration of this doctrine by the Roman Catholic Church does. The doctrine is defined as this: because it is the memorial of Christ's Passover, the Eucharist is also a sacrifice. Ignoring the extreme logical leap of that statement, the doctrine continues from there. Because It is also a sacrifice where Jesus' work on the cross is re-presented. That means it also means that this sacrifice is truly propitiatory. That is, having the power to make atonement for sin. The doctrine of transubstantiation was proclaimed as the authoritative position of the Catholic Church at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Let's also talk about the Treasury of Merit, otherwise known as the Treasury of the Church. The Treasury is, quote, the infinite value which can never be exhausted, which Christ's merits have before God. This treasury includes as well the prayers and good works of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the prayers and good works of all the saints. The treasury of merit is infinite, and according to the Roman Catholic Church, because Christ needed only shed a single drop of blood for our salvation, and yet he spilled all of it, leaving us, in their minds, with a supremely infinite abundance of good. How is it to be dispensed? Well, only according to the Pope, who has been, by lineage of position, given the keys to the kingdom. He's able to dispense the good of this alleged treasury, even if for political favors, power, and the destruction of political and religious enemies. To name a last theological point that relates to Luther, we must look at indulgences. There are two kinds of indulgences: plenary and partial. Partial indulgences are ones that can remove some of the temporal punishment for sins, while a plenary indulgence removes all of it. These are possible as a result of the Treasury of Merit. Most of these theological issues were only compounded by the fact that the services and scriptures were not in the tongue of the common people, leaving the vast majority unable to see for themselves what the scriptures say, but rather made them wholly dependent on the church and on the priest, trusting that what was being told to them was accurate to God's word and his commands. These issues of society and theology were spearheaded by the one to rule Rome and its church, the Vicar of Christ himself, the Pope. Let's example this in three popes in particular. First, let's look at Sixtus IV. To know Sixtus and his legacy and the effect on the times, one needs only to learn of the conspiracy against Lorenzo the Magnificent. Sixtus endorsed the plot that resulted in the assassination of Lorenzo's brother and the wounding of Lorenzo himself. These events occurred during the Mass. After surviving an assassination attempt, Lorenzo was then excommunicated by Sixtus. It is said that Sixtus endorsed the plot against Lorenzo, but not the assassination. And following Sixtus was Pope Innocent VIII. Pope Innocent VIII was not one to cease the leveraging of his religious and spiritual office for the sake of political favors. Innocent, in fact, obtained the position as a result of election manipulation by Cardinal de la Rovere, who, in the cover of night, convinced the other cardinals to change their vote. Innocent would continue this trajectory of moves for political reasons through the relationship that would result in something so horrific. There would be books and movies and tales for generations to come. Though Innocent could not have predicted such a thing, it was a single papal edict, typically referred to as a papal bull, that would launch him into the terrible spotlight of history. In 1484, Innocent would receive a request by two German inquisitors regarding a papal bull to support investigations into witchcraft. You see, these particular inquisitors had run into issues with the local Catholic authorities, who refused to aid them in their pursuit of heretical witchcraft. While the papal bull that was issued lacked the official dogmatic pronouncements, it was a clearly politically driven move to influence and remove any obstacles in the way of the inquisitors. The name of those German inquisitors, you ask? Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. They would later author a book titled Malleus Maleficarum, otherwise known as the Hammer of Witches, a book that some 100 years later would be the leading material of the witchcraft trials around the world. Typically only known as the Salem witch trials, the trials were much more widespread than just Salem, and would place, forever, a dark stain in our history books. And if you think the political nature of Innocent stopped there, you would be wrong. Innocent issued a bull declaring the Waldensians heretics for their stand against the Catholic Church and its doctrines, and issued an extermination order, along with a plenary indulgence, a full remission of the temporal punishments of sin for anyone who would crusade against them. Our third and final pope is Alexander VI. Alexander VI, like his predecessor, came to the papal seat under a shroud of alleged bribery. It is said that for the promise of future positions, many were led to switch over their votes. Later, Alexander would use his papal office, like many others, to the political and military end. He would lead a vigorous pursuit of war against the Ottoman Turks. Notable to the rule of Alexander VI are his bulls issued around the time of Columbus landing in the New World. The bulls gave title of ownership over the newfound and occupied territories, rights to ecclesial patronage, the crown's collection of tithes, and commission to propagate the faith, and power to enslave the natives. But Luther was not alone in seeing these great issues. Great men had come before Luther, seeking to light a fire to recover proper theology of things from the scriptures. Men like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus laid down their kindling and lit a match, only to have it snuffed out by the Roman Catholic Church. Although their own fires were quelled, they would both not be able to escape the fire of Rome. Despite, however, their fire being snuffed out, the kindling still remained for a day when another man would come, a man who would light a fire never to be snuffed out. During our time period of focus, a new pope rolled around, bearing a strikingly familial bond to a figure previously spoken of. Do you remember Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was wounded during an assassination attempt approved by Sixtus IV? Well, Lorenzo the Magnificent went on to have sons, one of which was Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, who would take the same office as the man who had previously almost killed his father. The son of Lorenzo the Magnificent would take on the Pope and the papal name of Leo. He would be Leo X. And to bring one more thing back into perspective, to bring it all to a head, Leo X would find his church in the midst of a serious financial crisis. How would one in the place of the head of Rome handle this situation? Well, by selling the one thing that anyone would buy: indulgences. Pope Leo X would employ Johannes Tetzel to the position of the Commissioner of Indulgences in Germany. See, Tetzel had a particular gift. That was the gift of persuasion. It is said that if you needed to raise what was then the equivalent of billions of dollars from the back of a wagon, Tetzel was your man. And who would not trade money for eternal paradise if one really believed it was? And no one could doubt that it was, for the Pope himself was behind this, and the papal insignia were displayed and intentionally clearly visible wherever Tetzel preached. The tipping point for Luther would come when it was not just others who were purchasing these indulgences, but members of Luther's own congregation. Some showed up in the confession booth and beamed with ignorant pride as they showed Father Martin Luther, the precious certificates they had purchased from Tetzel. They were themselves unsure what the certificate they had purchased was worth, but surely Father Martinus would know and could redeem it for them now, couldn't he? Listen now. God and St. Peter call you. Consider the salvation of your souls and those of your loved ones departed. You priest, you noble, you merchant, you virgin, you matron, you youth, you old man, enter now into your church, which is the Church of St. Peter. Visit the most holy cross erected before you and ever imploring you. Have you considered that you are lashed in a furious tempest amid the temptations and dangers of the world, and that you do not know whether you can reach the haven of your mortal body, but of your immortal soul? Consider all who are contrite and have confessed and made contribution will receive complete remission of their sins. Consider, all who are contrite and have confessed and made contribution will receive complete remission of their sins. It was clear. Luther could not simply mind to his own flock and preach against this. But what of the others? Something more had to be done. Something to make everyone listen.